Let me tell you a story. This story was written by Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe. Ndume's school was backward in every sense of the word. Headmaster Michael Obi put his whole life into the work, and his wife hers too. He had two aims. A high standard of teaching was insisted upon, and the school compound was to be turned into a place of beauty. His wife Nancy's dream gardens came to life with the coming of the rains and blossomed. Beautiful hibiscus and almond hedges in brilliant red and yellow marked out the carefully tended school compound from the rank neighborhood bushes. One evening, as Obi was admiring his work, he was scandalized to see an old woman from the village hobble right across the compound through a marigold flower bed and the hedges. On going up there, he found faint signs of an almost disused path from the village across the school compound to the bush on the other side. "It amazes me," Obi said to one of his teachers who had been at the school 3 years, "that you people allowed the villagers to make use of this footpath. It is simply incredible." He shook his head. Soon after, heavy sticks were planted closely across the path at the two places where it entered and left the school premises. These were further strengthened with barbed wire. 3 days later, the village priest of Ani called on the headmaster. He was an old man, and he walked with a slight stoop, and he carried a walking stick. "I have heard," he said, after the usual exchange of cordialities, "that our ancestral footpath has recently been closed." "Yes," replied Mr. Obi, "we cannot allow people to make a highway of the school compound." "Look here, my son," said the priest, bringing down his walking stick. "This path was here before you were born and before your father was born. The whole life of this village depends on it. Our dead relatives depart by it, and our ancestors visit us by it. But most important, it is the path of children coming in to be born." Achebe's short story, Dead Man's Path, is short. It is less than 4 pages long. It continues briefly after this exchange, though, with the death of a woman in childbirth. There was no path for the child to come in by, you see. And after that, the villagers have just about enough of Mr. Obi's zeal. And so they tear down the fences, and they tear down the barbed wire, and they tear down the bushes and the gardens, and they tear down a school building. The path of the dead and the path of the living, and the villagers win in the end. They will not be subdued. The ancestral footpath in Achebe's story reminds me of the paths that we travel, the paths we discover, the paths we forge. Some of these paths have led the dead to their end. Others have helped children to be born, and still others have shown us new ways that we never could have imagined. They are the paths of our hearts, the paths of our deepest knowing, our strongest desires. They are the paths our ancestors traveled and the ones our children's children will know. I am speaking metaphorically, of course, but footpaths like the one in the story of Mr. Obi and the priest are a very real worldly phenomenon. Some of the ways forged by the footsteps of walkers are ancient, like the one in the story, and institutions and edifices are built on and around them. Others emerge after landscapes are meticulously planned and planted. I I first noticed paths like that about 10 years ago when my spouse, Anthony, was a graduate student at another beautifully manicured school. At the end of the day, I would walk to meet him at Yale's environmental school, following the paved paths through the campus until I got to the hill behind his building. There, the paved path continued straight ahead, leading to the sidewalk that directed pedestrians toward the front of the building, known as Croon Hall. The back door of Croon, though, was right up the hill. And so, ever since the building had opened in 2009, students and faculty alike had veered off that paved path and marched up that hill. And by the time we were there in 2011, a well-worn path had already appeared. "What do you think this is called?" Anthony asked one day as we walked along the path to Croon's back door. "What?" I said. This situation," he said, "of there not being a path where people want to go and them making one. There has to be a name for it." It turns out there is a name for it: desire paths. According to Robert McFarlane, the author, desire paths are, quote, "the paths and tracks made over time by the wishes and the feet of walkers, especially those paths that run contrary to design or planning. Free will ways," he calls them. They happen in the seats of government. The lawn of the National Congress of Brazil is one example, with paths crisscrossing an otherwise manicured lawn. They happen on backwoods trails. They happen on college and hospital campuses, in public parks, and yes, in ancestral villages. Desire paths might infuriate zealous headmasters, but they often inspire urban planners, because they give them insight into where and how people want to be moving, into the reality of people's lives, into the forces that guide us. According to Andrew Furman, a professor of interior design and architecture at Ryerson University in Toronto, desire paths tell us about the importance of not having someone prescribe your path. These unplanned and unpaved thoroughfares help all of us to see what the world looks like when we step off the path that has been outlined for us. Desire paths, Furman says, are about not following the script. Instead, he says, they exemplify resistance. He goes on, an individual can really write their own story. It's something really powerful, he says, if you do have that agency to move. Now, many of us know how costly and how precious and sometimes how scarce that agency can be. And so I wonder this morning, how has your story been written? The story of your life, the story of your love, of your work, your passion, the story you are still writing in this moment, and this one, and this one. Has your story been written along a single paved path, straight, narrow, set out for you at birth? Parts of it, perhaps, but I would venture to guess not all of it, by the very simple fact of your presence here this morning. I would guess that somewhere along the way you veered off one path or another and took a path that wasn't prescribed. Maybe you even had to tear down some barbed wire to get to the path of your desire. Desire, by the way, comes from the Latin, meaning feel the want of. Miss, regret. Desire paths are not just those we want to take, they are the ones we will regret not taking, the ones we are compelled to venture down. Perhaps the path you took was a path of defiant resistance. It was most likely not the path of least resistance. Because instead of staying on the paved path, instead of staying on level ground, at some point you marched up the hill. And I wonder if the desire path or paths that you've followed in your life have led you right to where you wanted and needed to be. Because sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't, right? Sometimes we don't know that the path we are on is the one most deeply connected to the desires of our hearts until we are deep in the gloomy wood, until we are in uncharted territory, unsure of where we are headed. And in those moments, we have to trust the path itself. We have to trust that still small voice within that tells us this way, follow me. Does that sound familiar? For many of us, it sure does, because this congregation followed a long and winding desire path through many wilderness years to reach this destination. And the journey continues. It is an uncharted communal journey that requires all of us to both lead and to follow at times, to trust ourselves and each other, and to care for one another. It requires us to understand the desires of our hearts and the call of the Spirit. I have been thinking about desire paths again of late because I recently started out on a new path. I am the newest chaplain at Woodward Academy here in Atlanta. It is a job I never would have imagined for myself, and one that I think I have been working toward for the past 20 years of my professional life. I am teaching comparative religion to high school seniors and social emotional learning to kids from kindergarten to 6th grade. I am guiding middle schoolers and high schoolers in strengthening our interfaith community, and I provide pastoral care to a community of over 3,000 students, faculty, and staff. My days are full, my brain is very full, and my heart is regularly full to bursting. I will tell you, I have not spent as much time as I have with high schoolers in the past few months since I was a high schooler myself. And I had forgotten how terrifyingly amazing everything is when one is 15, 16, 17, 18. I had forgotten how it feels to live in the pressure cooker of academic and athletic and artistic achievement, and perhaps most challenging social achievement. I had forgotten how powerful and profound it is to discover oneself again and again, deliberately at times and completely by accident at other times. I had forgotten what it feels like to travel paths that are totally new, paths that no one has been down before, paths where revelation is waiting around every single bend. These feelings flooded back to me this week when I witnessed our LGBTQ students bravely and generously sharing the stories of just some of the paths they have already traveled. I will not share more of their stories now, of course, in order to protect their privacy, but let me just say simply that this Pride Sunday, I am holding close in my heart all members of the queer community of all ages who have faced and are facing the uncharted territory of discovering who you are and sharing your beautiful, precious self with the world, risking misunderstanding, risking rejection, risking far worse sometimes. We celebrate you wherever you are on your journey, on your path. This congregation, this people, this faith are like fans at a marathon, holding up signs with your name on them, cheering you on. We have food and we have water, and we have foil blankets, and we are ready to run alongside you, and we are ready to stop when the time is right, and we are here to witness the joy and the pain and the hardship and the triumph. And we are here to work together to clear the path toward a more just future. Because that is the power of community, is it not? The wisdom and the power of people who need people. Queer community, religious community, school communities. There is power when fellow travelers invite others to travel along our paths. Power in saying, let me understand your journey better by following the path of your desire, the way of your wishes for a time. Let me trip through the pitfalls. Let me witness the dangers you've faced. Let me see what you've discovered along the way, and let me see in turn what I might discover too, and then what we can discover together. Because the truth is, not one of us knows our destination. Each of us travels our way one moment at a time. That is the curse and the blessing of the magic of being human. We are what we are, after all. But we need not know the destination, because it is enough, the poet says, to set out. And I hope that this idea is as comforting this morning to you as it has been to me of late. Just the other day, I was profoundly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the pile of the undone. At work, at home, it was blocking my path. And I wondered if I would do better to find a different path altogether. Not knowing which way to turn, I turned to my fellow traveler and I asked my spouse for help. What should I do next? I pleaded. And Anthony might not have known that he was going to quote Disney's Frozen 2, but that is sure what came out. Just do the next right thing, he said. And I pictured then the character of Anna in the film, lost and cold and alone in a dark cave, crawling out hand over hand, one painstaking step at a time. And so I took a deep breath, and whatever it was, I did the next right thing in that moment. I set out again on my own desire path, the one I never expected, the one whose end I cannot see, the one I do not always understand, the one I am traveling by faith. The paths of our hearts, the paths of our desire are not always the paths of least resistance. Sometimes they are old, ancestral paths, and sometimes they are new ways forged in faith. Sometimes they are both at the same time. The people of the village knew that the way of the ancestors was necessary so that the new could be born. And they would not rest until the way was clear so their future could begin. We do not always know how to travel these desire paths, only that we must. We are compelled, and so we set out, knowing that our lives depend on it, knowing that the path before us may be the very one that allows us to survive.